I'm the voice for Sherry. The big voice for Sherry, the final voice for her.
I feel good. So, I wouldn't say she's very good with money.
The Perfect Lie, the Sherry Papini story. On Thanksgiving morning, a woman stumbled onto a California highway in chains, covered in bruises, with a word burned into her shoulder. The nation wept for her. The FBI searched for her kidnappers. Her husband begged on national television for answers. There were no kidnappers. There never were. Her full name was Sherry Louise Grafe Papini. She was 34 years old. She lived in Redding, California, a mid-sized city in Shasta County, nestled in the northern Sacramento Valley, flanked by mountains and pine forests, and the kind of quietness that makes strangers feel safe. Redding is not the kind of place where dramatic things are supposed to happen. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children ride bikes after school, where a missing woman is genuinely alarming because things like that simply do not happen here. Sherry was born on the 11th of June, 1982, and grew up in Mount Shasta, California. Mount Shasta is even smaller than Redding, a town of fewer than 4,000 people, defined by its towering volcanic peak and a certain spiritual, almost mythological identity. Growing up there means growing up with space, with silence, with very little to do, and very much to imagine. For Sherry, childhood was not the idyllic mountain upbringing it might sound like. According to interviews conducted for the Hulu documentary Perfect Wife, her parents frequently fought and struggled to support Sherry and her older sister, Sheila. The household was described as volatile. When she was a teenager, things at home deteriorated to a breaking point. At 16, Sherry dropped out of high school and ran away, landing first in Los Angeles and then in the Bay Area. This detail, the running away, would come to mean something later. But in the years that followed her teenage flight, Sherry appeared to rebuild. She got her life together, at least on the surface. She found her way back to Northern California. She found work. She found a man. She and Keith Papini had been together since 2006, and they married in October 2009. Keith worked as a home theater specialist at Best Buy. Sherry had previously worked as an account executive for AT&T, but by the time the couple had children, she had stepped back from her career and become a full-time stay-at-home mother. Together, they had 2 children, 1 son and 1 daughter. Their ages at the time of her disappearance were roughly 2 and 4 years old, small enough to still need everything, young enough to not understand when mommy didn't come home. To the outside world, the Papinis looked like a success story. From the outside, Keith and Sherry Papini appeared to have an idyllic life. They were outwardly loving toward each other and their 2 young children. They had good friends and family living nearby. Sherry was known in her circle as someone who cared intensely about her appearance. Her long blonde hair in particular was something people associated with her identity. She was fit, she was active, and she jogged regularly through her neighborhood on Sunrise Drive. She was the kind of woman who seemed, to her community, to have it all figured out. But people who knew Sherry more closely described someone considerably more complicated. Friends who spoke to investigators recalled her tendency to lie and run away. That is how she used to deal with things as a child. Friend Asia Coleman told the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. When things got hard, she would just run away. There were whispers. 2 investigators later noted that there were infidelity issues in her background that even Keith had been aware of. The marriage, for all its photogenic warmth, carried tensions that were not visible to casual observers. There was something else in Sherry's history that would only come to light years later, a detail buried in a sheriff's office report from 2003. That year, her mother filed a report with the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, alleging that Sherry had been harming herself and blaming the injuries on others. Sherry would have been 21 years old. The pattern documented in that report, self-inflicted harm, misdirected blame, would echo forward through time with a resonance that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable to consider. By 2016, however, none of that history was visible to the community around her. What people saw was a devoted mother. A pretty, blonde, athletic woman who loved her children, who jogged her neighborhood in the mornings, who had, it seemed, built something real and stable from what had once been a chaotic young life. Prior to the events that brought her into the national spotlight, Papini was described as a stay-at-home mother dedicated to her family. That was the version of Sherry Papini that the world would fall in love with when she disappeared. That was the version of Sherry Papini that the world would mourn. And that was the version of Sherry Papini that, it would eventually emerge, had been constructed carefully, deliberately, and over a very long period of time for an audience. On the morning of November 2nd, 2016, Keith Papini left for work as usual. The children were dropped at daycare as usual. Sherry put on her running shoes, stepped outside into the Reading morning, and set off down Sunrise Drive. Hours passed. The children were not picked up from daycare. Keith came home to an empty house. He checked his Find My iPhone app and located Sherry's phone near Sunrise Drive. He went to the location and retrieved it. Her phone was there. Her earbuds were there. Strands of her blonde hair were caught in the earbuds. Sherry was not there. Keith Papini called 911. And from that moment forward, an entire nation would pour its grief, its fear, and its resources into finding a woman who did not need to be found. What no one knew yet, what no one would know for 6 more years, was that Sherry Papini already knew exactly where she was. To understand what Sherry Papini did on the morning of November 2nd, 2016, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to a marriage that had grown quiet in the wrong ways, to a woman who felt unheard, to a man from her past who answered the phone when she called, and to a plan so meticulous, so coldly engineered, that investigators would later describe it as one of the most sophisticated hoaxes they had ever encountered. The man at the center of it was James Reyes. Reyes was Sherry's ex-boyfriend, someone she had known since childhood. A connection that predated Keith, predated the marriage, predated the children and the house on Sunrise Drive and all the trappings of the life she had built. According to his uncle, Reyes had no prior trouble with the law and had previously worked at a skate store in Costa Mesa, California, a modest, unremarkable life in Southern California, far removed from the intensity that Sherry was about to drag him into. By all accounts, James Reyes was not a predator. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was, investigators would conclude, a man who had once loved a woman and never fully stopped, and who, when that woman called him with a desperate story, believed every word of it. The contact between them had been re-established quietly, carefully, in the shadows of Sherry's marriage. According to federal investigators, Sherry and Reyes had been talking to one another as early as December 2015, nearly a year before her disappearance. They used prepaid phones to communicate, corroborated through evidence of 2 prepaid cellular phones tied to Reyes, communicating with a corresponding device from Sherry's location. This was not impulsive. This was not a moment of weakness. This was deliberate concealment, sustained over months, using technology specifically chosen to avoid detection. On the documentary series Caught in the Lie, Sherry described beginning what she called an emotional affair with Reyes as her marriage to Keith deteriorated. She claimed she turned to her former boyfriend when she could not find emotional support at home. She said, "James was someone who was listening to me and hearing me. That's what I needed." Whether that account is the full truth remains disputed. What is not disputed is that by November 2016, the two were in regular secret contact and that Sherry had a plan. What she told Reyes, according to his account to investigators, was a story designed to trigger his protective instincts. Reyes told detectives that Sherry had said she was being abused by her husband, Keith. She was trying to get away from her husband. Reyes told investigators unaware that Sherry's allegations against Keith were unfounded. Keith Papini has consistently denied any abuse. No charges were ever filed against him. No evidence of domestic violence was found. But Reyes did not know that. He knew only what Sherry had told him, and he believed her. And so when she asked him to come, he came. On the 2nd of November 2016, Reyes had a friend rent a car for him, after which he drove to where he was supposed to pick up Sherry. Once there, she got into the back seat and laid down while he made the several-hour drive back to his home in Costa Mesa, California. He explained to investigators that he picked her up in a rental car, a friend leased for him, and that he knew nothing about Hispanic women abducting her. At the moment of pickup, Sherry disposed of her prepaid phone. She had also brought with her, investigators later determined, a bag containing items she planned to use to bind her own wrists and ankles. She had thought of everything. For 22 days, Sherry Papini lived in James Reyes's home in Costa Mesa, while her husband, her children, her community, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI searched for her across multiple states. During those 22 days, a GoFundMe raised nearly $50,000 for the search. Hundreds of tips flooded law enforcement. Keith Papini gave tearful media interviews. The nation watched. And Sherry, according to investigators, was in a residential apartment in Southern California, hidden, warm, and by all evidence voluntarily present. The injuries were the part that required the most planning and the most disturbing degree of deliberate self-harm. Sherry asked Reyes to bang a hockey puck off her leg, giving investigators the impression she'd been seriously abused. She also fractured her own nose on a hockey stick that Reyes held up. She ate less during those weeks, giving her an emaciated appearance. She contracted a rash on her arm from cleaning supplies. Reyes revealed that Sherry asked him to inflict injuries on her, though he refused many of her requests. The brand on her shoulder, the word Exodus, burned into her skin, was carried out by Reyes at her request. Let that settle for a moment. A woman asked a man to press a hot instrument into her shoulder to make the story of her captivity more convincing. She endured it. She planned it. She wore it home. The psychological scaffolding holding this plan together was extraordinary in its construction and terrifying in what it reveals. Here was a woman with a documented history of self-harm, reaching back to at least 2003. Here was a woman whose own friends had told investigators she ran away when things got hard. Here was a woman who had, somewhere along the line, learned that suffering visible, dramatic, physical suffering was the most reliable way to make people stop asking questions and start offering help. She had learned that wounds commanded attention, and so she made wounds. Federal prosecutors would later say in court filings that the hoax was deliberate, well-planned, and sophisticated. That description, clinical as it is, barely captures the full architecture of what Sherry had built. She had secured a secret phone. She had maintained a clandestine relationship for nearly a year. She had chosen a pickup location. She had injured herself systematically over 3 weeks. She had prepared her restraints in advance. And she had constructed a false narrative, 2 armed Hispanic women in a dark SUV, detailed enough to send investigators searching across the western United States for suspects who did not exist. Back in Redding, Keith Papini was falling apart. He pleaded publicly with the nation for help. It is excruciating. I don't like to think too much about it because I just assume that I'm going to get a phone call any second or she's going to show up at my house, he told ABC News in 2016. Their 2 young children, 2 and 4 years old, were without their mother. The community had mobilized in grief. And Sherry, according to every piece of evidence federal investigators would eventually assemble, was watching the coverage from Costa Mesa. Then, after 22 days, she decided she was ready to go home. She told Reyes she wanted to return. He drove her back north. At the time, Sherry disposed of her prepaid phone and had a bag that contained items to bind her wrists and ankles. She chained herself. She prepared her story. She arranged herself on the side of a highway in the pre-dawn darkness of Thanksgiving morning, bound and emaciated and branded, waiting to be found. And she was found. and the nation wept for her. And for 3 more years, she maintained every word of the lie. What no one watching the news coverage could have known, what even James Reyes perhaps did not fully understand, was that the most dangerous thing about this moment was not what had already happened. It was what came next. 6 years of doubling down, of false police interviews, of fraudulent compensation claims, of innocent people smeared, and a community's trust quietly corroded, all in service of a story that only one person knew was fiction. The morning Sherry stepped out of that car on County Road 17, the hoax did not end. It was just beginning. It was 4:30 inches the morning, on November 24th, 2016, Thanksgiving Day, when the first 911 calls came in. Motorists driving along Interstate 5 inches, Yolo County, California, spotted something in the pre-dawn darkness that made them pull over. A figure small, slight, staggering, moving along the highway in the cold before sunrise. A number of motorists called 911, including a truck driver who stopped and waited for the California Highway Patrol to arrive, to report a woman standing or running down the middle of Interstate 5. When officers arrived, what they found appeared to confirm every worst fear the public had held for 22 days. Sherry Papini had reappeared 150 miles south of where she had disappeared, still wearing restraints. Her nose was swollen. She had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, burns on her left forearm, bruises and rashes across many parts of her body. Her long blonde hair, the hair that friends and family had described as central to her identity, had been cut to shoulder length. And burned into her right shoulder was a blurred brand, a mark that she would later tell investigators resembled a verse from the Book of Exodus. She had a chain around her waist, tethered to one of her wrists. She was taken to Woodland Hospital in Yolo County, where she was reunited with Keith. Keith Papini arrived at that hospital on Thanksgiving morning and saw his wife for the first time in 22 days. He has described that moment in interviews, the curtain pulled back, the injuries visible, his own involuntary flash of disbelief. When I pulled back the curtain, and I saw her, and I saw the look in her eyes, I felt in that moment that she was lying, Keith said years later. And it wasn't until I went to her to embrace her, and I could just see the amount of injuries, bruises, burns to her body. And it was a shock to me. And I remember thinking how horrible of me to even think that she could have done this to herself. He pushed the doubt away. He embraced her. He wept. They both did. The statement released by the family that day was read to the media by Sherry's sister. It said, according to reporting at the time, that they were overwhelmed with joy and grateful for the community's support. The Shasta County Sheriff, Tom Bozenko, told reporters, "We are ecstatic to report that Sherry Papini has been located and has been reunited with her family on this day of Thanksgiving." He warned that the investigation was far from over, but his tone was celebratory. The missing mother had been found on Thanksgiving. It was the kind of story that writes itself, the kind of story a nation desperately wants to believe. And they believed it. All of them. In the hours that followed, the story spread across every major news outlet in the country. The image of Sherry Papini, the official Shasta County Sheriff's missing persons photo, her blonde hair long, her smile wide, ran alongside breathless reporting about her survival, her injuries, her courage. People magazine would later feature the case on its front cover. True crime programs picked it up. The internet's appetite for the story was insatiable. Here was a young mother, a devoted wife, snatched from her morning jog by monsters, and she had survived. She had come home on Thanksgiving. The narrative was almost unbearably perfect. Meanwhile, in the hospital, and then in the days that followed at home, investigators needed to talk to Sherry. And here is where the performance became extraordinary in its sustained precision. Recorded police interviews with Sherry in the hours after her return showed she was reluctant to speak with investigators, claiming that her abductors had told her she was going to be trafficked to someone in law enforcement. It was a masterful detail, a built-in excuse for why she couldn't fully cooperate with the very people trying to help her. She had constructed a reason to be vague that itself sounded like evidence of trauma. Given her reticence to speak, officers had her husband sit in with her during one interview and ask the questions about what happened. Detectives returned for a second interview, but Sherry remained reluctant to open up. When she did speak, the story she provided was elaborate, detailed, and entirely fictional. 2 women. There was an older one and a younger one, she told police. They were Hispanic. They spoke Spanish a lot. She described a dark SUV. She described being taken at gunpoint. She described being chained to a pole. She described her captors keeping their faces hidden. She said she could hear what she described as really annoying Mexican music, and that she overheard snippets of conversation in Spanish. Every detail was false. Every detail was chosen. The effect on the community was immediate and profound. In Redding and across Northern California, the hunt for suspects rattled the Latino community. Alan Ernesto Phillips, co-founder of the Northern Hispanic Latino Coalition, told ABC News that Latina women were fearful they might look like one of those people in the sketch. Real women, real mothers, real daughters, real members of a community that had done nothing, lived for months under the shadow of suspicion that Sherry Papini had deliberately cast upon them. It was a cruelty built into the architecture of the lie that investigators would not fully reckon with until years later. In the weeks following her return, Sherry's story commanded an enormous investigative apparatus. Detectives authored close to 20 search warrants, including some in Michigan, and were examining cell phone records, bank accounts, email, and social media profiles. The FBI was formally involved. Tips flooded in from across the country. Resources that belonged to other cases, other missing persons, other crimes, were redirected toward finding 2 armed Hispanic women who existed only in Sherry Papini's imagination. According to a statement by her husband, Sherry was physically abused during her captivity, had her nose broken and her hair cut off, and weighed 87 pounds when she was released. That weight, 87 pounds, became one of the most reported details of the case. A number that made people gasp. She had lost so much of herself. She had suffered so deeply. She had been starved and broken and branded, and she had done most of it to herself. The brand on her shoulder, the word Exodus burned into her skin, would take investigators nearly a year to incorporate into their public account of the case. When investigators questioned Sherry at a later date, she claimed it looked like a verse from the book of Exodus. The religious dimension of the brand added yet another layer of apparent menace to the invented captors. These were not just criminals, Sherry's story implied, but people with a religious agenda, a message, perhaps a larger operation. Meanwhile, at home, Sherry Papini resumed her life. She attended therapy billed to the California Victim Compensation Board. She received disability payments. She participated in media coverage. She watched, as investigators would later confirm, the national story unfold around her, with the same attention a storyteller pays to her own work. And the one person who knew the truth, James Reyes, sitting in his apartment in Costa Mesa, said nothing. He had been told a story about abuse. He had helped a woman he believed was in danger, and now he watched her on the news, describing the ordeal she had supposedly endured at the hands of 2 women, and he stayed silent. What broke that silence, what finally began to unravel, everything was something Sherry could not have planned for, could not have anticipated when she constructed her lie back in 2015 and 2016. It was science. It was a technology that barely existed in the form investigators needed when she first disappeared. And that had advanced dramatically by the time they turned to it in desperation. It was waiting, quietly, in the fibers of the clothing she had worn home.